Morning. Well, yeah, so I was asked today to introduce Visual DNA because we're a tech company actually just down the road in Shoreditch, but we're doing some pretty amazing stuff around using technology, big data, and personality to make predictions. And I think a lot of us make predictions on our own in the physical world quite normally. So Sam already predicted that Craig will swear later based on his personality. I could have predicted that most men here would be wearing half a suit because we're in business and it's an event. We either wear jeans, shirt and suit jacket, or Sam wearing suit shorts, suit trousers, shirt, no jacket. And if you look around, generally that's what we tend to do, and we could have predicted that. So we as a business are actually helping people do that online. So like many companies, we are on a journey. So if you haven't heard of Visual DNA, we're probably at mature startup phase, which is we're about 150 people, like I said, based just down the road. But what we're really doing is we're combining big data analytics and psychology, and that's since 2008. And big data, I thought I'll give my sort of translation of what I think big data is. It's not lots of data, because we've had that since the 80s. It's actually about the processing power that we can now do, the amount of sources of data we can use to actually make predictions, do things in real time. And that's what we've been specializing in. We've got the biggest psychographic database in the world. So that's what allows us to do what we're doing and make the predictions that we're making. So if you think about a lot of the stuff that you'll learn today, wow, what was that? A lot of the stuff that you'll learn today around psychology, neuroscience, etc., has been restricted potentially by the number of people that they've had access to. The experiments, you know, when you call people into a room, give them a bag of crisps and a glass of wine and ask them how they feel, that's only a finite number of people. We're already tracking and listening to and understanding the behaviors of around 300 million profiles. And in the next couple of years, we should be reaching over 1 billion. And then how are we using this? And you know, to Sam's point, the point of today is how can business start using a lot of the stuff that academics have been understanding and using to understand people, but also how do we actually transfer that into something that's useful? So what does it mean around sort of big data and psychology? Why are we where we are today, and what is the main opportunity? I think that if we think about sort of the customer and people, consumers, employees, whatever it is that, you know, historically we've operated very much in this physical and emotional world. You know, being somewhere, the fact that we're all here in the room, the fact that we can see each other, look at each other. And we all understand that we're emotional beings. We all have a certain personality. We all differ in certain ways. And when we meet people or when we have very close friends, we get very good at understanding that person's personality and potentially predicting how they may react to a certain piece of news, to a certain picture, to a certain event. And we've done that very, very well, and that's sort of how we've evolved. More recently, we've been dealing with the digital self. So, you know, digital is seen as a huge opportunity around reach. We can suddenly talk to a lot more people. But one of the challenges that we've suddenly realized is that what we've started measuring in this area is very, very little to do with the emotional and the physical self. So we've started just thinking about what people do, when they do it, and where they're doing it. You know, how many visits are people having on my website? What's the average checkout value? And then from there, we're also trying to design content based just to drive more and more traffic to our sites or to our digital assets or to the stories that we're creating. And I think you'll see some of these sort of other speakers later on will have some fantastic videos which show the virility of what can happen with the internet when you actually attach to someone emotionally, what can be shared, and then what we do as humans. But the problem is most of us are sending out lots and lots of content with very little understanding of actually who are the emotional person behind these actions. So as Visual DNA, that's what we're doing at the moment. We're connecting the emotional being to that digital persona. Also, what we're starting to do then is the physical, which I'll take you through in a second. So we're trying to help people understand the who and a why at a massive scale. You know, that's the important thing, again, is that if you think about, if we can start to understand how people behave in particular contexts or particular scenarios, we can then also map back the other way by looking at behaviors to understand personality as well. So how do we as a business collect our data? So we use image-based personality quizzes at the moment. And there is a stand upstairs if anyone wants to have a go and find out, you know, how they fit on the scale of ocean. But the thing about this is that it's extremely successful and extremely viral. People enjoy doing the quizzes that we put out there. And we don't incentivize in any other way other than understand more about yourself. And also, if you start thinking about things like quantified self, the fact that people are tracking themselves more, tracking their dreams, all of these growing aspects of things like wearables, is because people do want to start understanding more about themselves and how can they use that to live a better life, essentially. So this is how we collect our data. So we ask people questions, which of these looks like fun to you? But that then helps us actually start gathering personality or psychographic data against those individuals. And they go through these. Some of our quizzes take 5 minutes, some of them take 10 minutes, but we have over 80% completion rates, as I said, because there's a lot of enjoyment and fun of actually doing these quizzes. And at the end of it, we end up with a scale, essentially, of the individual. So we use Ocean and Big Five, and there's psychologists and people here who'll probably go into a lot more detail about this, but essentially, in academia, this is recognized as the best way to understand personality and how people differ. And when this starts coming actually very, very sort of applicable for business is when we start thinking about, okay, what are the stories that we should be telling, or how do we really start segmenting our audiences? Because your personality type will dictate how you react to a story. So if we start thinking about, if we just even think about some scenarios, so openness, sort of how artistic someone is, adventurous, consistent, cautious, inventive. And a real-life scenario that's quite easy to think about here is if you think about hotels. Some people like to stay in a particular hotel where all around the world, the rooms are in the same place, the toilet is in the same corner, there's always the same coffee machine there. That's driven by their personality and what they feel comfortable in. Where you've got more localized hotels, which are more boutique hotels, they actually sell themselves more based on the fact that it's different, it's local, it'll be a completely new experience. And depending on someone's personality type, will predict their likelihood of which hotel they're likely to choose. The same piece around conscientiousness, sort of how organized or careless you are. I'll talk a bit more about how we're helping people predict in credit and risk, but if you think about sort of Sheila's Wheels and how insurance, they used to have women's only car insurance. That's now illegal because you can't target based on gender, but the whole point about the product was it wasn't actually the fact that you were a woman or a man, it was the fact that you had particular characteristics that meant that you drove more carefully, or like a girl, as some people may say. But the whole point is that that's what the insurers were targeting. And so it's those kinds of thinking that actually sort of changing the product. So things like extroversion. Someone told me the other day the best way to stop an extrovert drinking is to tell them people won't listen to them when they're drunk. The other one, going back to someone who's more conscientious, even on that piece, you tell them they'll make more mistakes when they're drunk. So again, the same story, and when people are talking about persuasive content and all of those things later on, it will depend on the personality of the person, of how they react to those messages, whether you should be talking about the positive or the negative. Agreeableness, so this is, again, this is a really interesting one if you think about things like gamification. So lots of people talk about leaderboards, how important it is to be competitive, how do we get our customers all together? Well, someone who's very high on agreeableness is actually more about the whole. So they're more worried about ethics and things like that, whereas someone who's low agreeableness is going to be much more competitive. So again, if you start segmenting and thinking about your customers, your audiences, or the products you're developing in customers this way, it means you can actually start predicting how people will behave. Neuroticism in the world of social, if someone who's highly neurotic is very, very emotional, it doesn't mean that they're crazy and they're going to jump out of planes and they're going to panic. But it does mean if something goes wrong, they need to be engaged on an emotional level. So it also means that they're more likely to turn to social media and start screaming about your brand and telling how crap you are, how upset they are, my package is late, etc., etc. Whereas someone who's much lower on the scale would like to know the process, what's gone wrong, how should I be spoken to? Tell me exactly what happened, but I'm less likely to have an emotional reaction to what you're talking about or what's actually happened. So this is what we're doing. So you imagine at the moment we've got 300 million profiles being tracked across the web. So we're seeing how each of these different traits, depending where people are on the scale, how they react to different things. And that's what then allows us to predict certain things and certain behaviors. In business, we spend a lot of time thinking about our brand, our values, our belief systems, what we stand for, what's our personality as a business. But we spend very little time then thinking about our customer's personality. We don't sort of think about, okay, what is it that's very important to them? Okay, I've got a product, my product's fantastic, look how cool we are, etc., etc. But the thing that we forget is that people don't generally buy for functional reasons anymore. There's just too much choice. One of the other things that the internet did do was the cost of coming to market and being able to reach a lot of people made it a lot more competitive. The chicken, why a chicken? The whole point of the chicken is that we used to buy chickens to eat. That was it. I'm hungry, I need protein, I'll have a chicken. Now when you go around the supermarket, you just look at the plethora of choices of the types of chicken. And each of these choices, actually, when the guy sits next to me at work saw this slide, and he's like, I always buy organic chickens because they taste better. So straight onto Google, is that true? Blind taste testing, organic chickens don't taste better. But the story that he's told himself, and the reason he buys organic chickens, is a narrative that he's created in his mind, and the neuroscience guys, I'll leave that bit more to you. But it gives you an idea. So as brands and as people we're trying to communicate, we're using all of these actual messages to sell a chicken. Local farm, okay, someone who's worried about their local community. Free range, someone who's worried about the quality of life of a chicken. Fair trade, someone who's more worried about the quality of life for the farmer, and again, organic. And then you've got things like, and then potentially this is where you may be becoming functional, someone who hasn't got much time is buying the pre-basted chicken. But all of these things, and as brands, as we shout, all the ideas of gimmicks or what headlines do I use become irrelevant if you don't start segmenting and understanding your audiences based more on things like personality rather than last click. So as a business, where are we, I suppose, taking what we're learning to the market and applying it to the real world to try and make a difference? Credit and risk, so, and I'll take you through that. Marketing services, where I myself work, and consumer. Oh, so actually I won't take away there. And then also the thing that I'm very lucky with, so I sit up here, is then the people that underpin, I suppose, the business that I work in. So I'm very fortunate to work with some who are here, psychologists, behaviour economists, people who really, really understand people. We then add that to tech, big data, the ability to process information. It means then we've got a fantastic formula to really start answering some of life's questions or understanding why people do what they do online and very soon actually on and offline. And then we have creative, which is more around how do you engage, design, make sure things are beautiful. So consumer, so at the moment, as I said, we have very high completion rates of the quizzes themselves. But what do we give back? So we tell people who they are. So what does it mean to be you? And these are the kind of things that you should think about. And this is how potentially you could do certain things to get over particular fears. This is how you should address particular problems. And this has worked very, very well for us over the last few years. But as our data processing has got bigger, as we've learned more and more about people, we've got more and more data, it's actually giving us a better opportunity to actually help and affect the lives of more and more consumers. And what that means is actually it's about us attaching people's digital behavior, their personality, and their quantified stuff, or their physical being as well. So we're looking at new data points and working with a few of the wearable companies. But we can actually start helping someone know. So if you wake up in the morning and you're always tired, we potentially be able to help you say, people like you who go to bed half an hour earlier wake up a lot more happier. Why not try and get into bed half an hour earlier? Or other opportunities are, you're feeling sad. People like you are at this particular event or who go to this museum feel much, much happier. Or people like you who tried to give up smoking, you did this way and have been 90% more successful. The opportunities become much, much bigger. So rather than at the moment, if you think of the way that news feeds work on something like a Facebook, which is your friend looked at this, your friend poked this, your friend liked that, etc., it's got nothing really to do with who you are, or it's not necessarily going to motivate you to do something or change something. But if you can start understanding how people like you with the same personality, the same, if you like, way of thinking and doing things to make themselves better, the opportunities become very, very exciting. So credit and risk. Surprisingly, a very, very sexy, people say big data is sexy. This, I think, is amazing of what we're doing as a business. So over half of the world's adult population does not have access to credit. And by credit, this isn't talking about what's happened in the city and we talk about recessions. It's a way out of poverty. If you think about in the sort of developed world, the access to mortgages, credit, all of these things actually make our lives better. In places like Russia, about 40% of the population have been just using cash for most of their adult lives. So when they come to actually apply for something like credit, a loan, business loan, etc., there is no kind of way of looking back at historical credit behaviour to actually lend them money. What we've done at scale is now we've made the links between personality and risk. So we've got banks actually, as you go through an online application, you actually go through one of our quizzes, and then that will decide whether or not you actually get a credit card or you get access to a mortgage, etc. This will make a big difference. So one of our drivers of business is to get 30 million people out of poverty in the next couple of years based on this model. Places like, if you think about Africa and all of these growing economies, you don't necessarily, everything's pay as you go, all of these things. It has a huge difference if you understand someone's likelihood to pay. And it's not about affordability, it's about the likelihood that they want to repay the loan by their personality status. This is also then being applied to, as I sort of alluded to earlier, things like insurance. And what was quite exciting for us, and again, it shows that psychology is, and the predictability. MasterCard wrote a recent paper about the fact that psychographic understanding is going to be one of the newest ways for lenders to enter into undeveloped markets. So I suppose, I sit in marketing, but this is the bit that sort of proves that this isn't all sort of kumbaya and fluffy, isn't it, and all nice that we all know each other. It's making real difference. And we're changing the way that, just because of how you behaved in the past doesn't mean that's how you're going to behave in the future. And then how do we play? So where I sit and work myself is how do we apply this to marketing services? I think one of the sort of, I suppose, the biggest letdowns for businesses and marketing has been, the internet. So the fact that it was such promise that, the first banner ad, again, doing a bit of sort of internet and Googling as we all do, the first banner ad achieved 78% click-through. Can you imagine that if we could all achieve that every time we sent something out now? Even an email, that'd be nice. Whereas now we're dealing with stats that are like 0.05%. And that's all been driven by the fact that we've just been pushing stuff out. We've seen the internet as an opportunity for us to shout about ourselves, done very little to understand about the recipients. And as it's got more and more competitive, it's getting more and more expensive. So people are, we're testing different headlines, A/B testing, multivariate testing. All of these things are fantastic tools, and of course they're going to help. But it's the underlying understanding of who we're talking to that will make the difference. A brand that, I think that's done things very, very well is someone like Nike, who's understood the personality of what drives their customers, and that drives things like the product development, the kind of content and experiences they create, which is around that competitiveness. So this is what we've just started rolling out for brands very, very recently, specifically sort of more recently around sort of e-commerce, because it's something that's very easy to understand, but actually the ability to segment and understand your audiences based on that scale. So actually, rather than sitting there as, I can't sit there and look at Google Analytics. I find it too difficult to understand because I need pictures. But the other case is that you start looking at your audience and understanding them based on their personality. So you start segmenting and seeing which product types or which particular part of my site is ringing true. I've got my audiences are growing, but it's this particular personality type that's growing with that audience. It's this type of person that's buying this product. So when I start thinking about one of the biggest challenges you see in most surveys that marketers face is creating relevant experiences and content. Well, if you understand the personality of your customers or the kind of things they're going to react to or how they're going to react to content, it's a great place to start. And then you add things like context on top of that. We did some really interesting stuff around working and domestic mothers. A lot of brands automatically think someone is now a mother. That means automatically you're all the same. No, well, and there's nothing wrong. I suppose the thing to make sure it's the most important thing to a career-driven or domestically driven mother was still their child. So it's not like one's a good mother or a bad mother, but actually some of the driving forces about where they want to be in 5 years' time. For example, a career-driven mother was 3 times more worried about their personal health than a domestically driven mother. Also, an easy one probably to understand is that one wants to retire, one wants to be a CEO. But if you're a brand and you actually want to go on a journey with that customer, and it's not just about selling nappies in that single instance, it's about understanding the life journey, what that person wants to be, or what they want to do, or how they want to be spoken to. And then the other bit, so, we predicted that certain things today about swearing, etc. But what you're seeing here is actually real data, where it's the fact that this green line here is just using first-party data, so just looking at behavioral data on a particular website. And then, as you might expect, the longer that someone's on the site, the easier it was to predict what they were going to do next. Essentially, in this instance, will they buy or not? When we add then personality or psychographic data on top of that, in the first minute, we actually increase predictions by 300%. In this instance, we could predict with 94.15% accuracy within 60 seconds whether that person was browsing or purchasing in that visit. Because we knew people with this personality type who are behaving this way are in buying mode or browsing mode. And this has huge implications when you start thinking about, okay, what do I try and do with this individual on my site, or what's the customer journey I'm trying to give? Do I try and force them into the basket, start throwing offers at them and cutting into my margin, or do I just try and capture an email address? Or when I retarget this individual, do I try and sell them something, or the fact that I know their personality or what's important to them, I'll actually ask them to do something else, rather than just come back and buy something from me. And these are the kind of activities that it's going to make it, A, cheaper to engage, because as we move into the world of programmatic buying, so I don't know if many people are aware, but a lot of stuff is happening in real time now. So when we're thinking about the display audiences, when we do a media display, it's not just about buying an advert on a particular site, it's the fact that things will happen in real time. As a particular person comes to a site, people are bidding of whose content gets in front of that individual. At the moment, the challenge is that people are still going back to that first slide about what we track in online, is we're just looking at behavior, what someone just did. So someone looked at a washing machine, okay, I'm going to follow them around the internet with a washing machine. So I'm going to bid a lot for every time that person goes on a website, because they obviously want to buy a washing machine from me. But actually, if you knew you sell washing machines, but that person has the personality type, and they're very likely to buy from you over a competitor, you'd outbid your competition for that individual. If you knew that they had a very low propensity to buy, and the behavior they were displaying wasn't someone who wanted to actually buy a washing machine, you wouldn't spend all your money following them around the internet with a washing machine. And these are the kind of things that actually, as businesses, we need to start thinking about more, about, okay, well, what is it my customers actually want? Otherwise, 0.05% is going to be 0.04% as an average, and it's just going to keep going down and down, and the cost of acquiring customers will go up and up and up. But only if we then start segmenting our audiences and understanding and predicting what it is they want from us, how it is they want us to talk to them. The same thing, when they've got a lot of people talk about sort of testing today, sort of multivariate testing and split testing. And testing is really, really important, because I can't tell you in the context of your brand, your site, in a particular, how someone is definitely going to behave. We can make some predictions early on, but by then observing, and over time, the predictions, obviously, the accuracy of the predictions go up and up. But if you're testing, fluffy cat versus fluffy dog wins. Right now, our website is covered in fluffy dogs. It's not a very, very sort of, sound test. It could be that, if you just split your data in half, it's just unlucky that you put all the dog lovers in one half and half your cat lovers in the dog lovers, and that's why the dog won. But if you understand, okay, this personality type reacts well to this type of message, whenever this personality type comes to my website, this is how I will talk to them. And so it's all about not just thinking about the lowest common denominator, it's actually not thinking about the click where someone's come from, it's trying to think more about the personality of the individual. And this is another one, every company, I want to get to know you. Like every survey I do after I buy something, or tell us more about you, Ed. A, what I tell you potentially isn't true. Also, I don't know what I want next. When people say, what's your next big purchase? I want to go on holiday, and then I go and buy a car. People are like, oh, Ed, you said you're going to go on holiday. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, you've just spent a fortune targeting me on cars. But, we're talking about understanding people, but we're doing very little to understand them. And that's where, the backlash of the age of the consumer, we no longer control our brand. All of these things are true because people don't mind telling you about themselves if they see the value in it. People don't mind telling a company lots about themselves if they think you'll use it in an honourable way or you'll use it to make their lives better. The problem is a lot of companies are just collecting data because they think they need to, or they're tracking particular behaviours because they think it's interesting, but then doing very little to benefit actually the person that gives you that information. And so I always have to put this slide in because one of my colleagues who's here today said, Ed, are you going to put your bike in the presentation? It's not me, but he thinks it looks just like me. And look, he's taking the photo now, so there you go, Michael, hi. But I think it's, the one thing is that, like I said, we were invited here today to introduce sort of visual DNA more, but, the big bit is there's a huge opportunity in understanding personality at scale. And I think a lot of the stuff you'll learn today is now very, very applicable, rather than sort of just thinking about, I wish I had a CAT scan. You can take those learnings and then apply them online. So that was me. Thank you.
Kind of the same question. So data. Very quickly, I imagine people are going to start locking down their data if you look at what's happening.
Yep.
And then my instinctive thing when you're talking about psychographic testing for credit is how do I gain so I get the best results? What do we do with that?
So we've got a big team that works on this, and so there's been some really interesting tests. So the things around the fact that we use image-based quizzes makes it harder to cheat. We also have a number of things where we track behavior when people are actually doing the quizzes themselves. There's quizzes, I don't even know, so it's sort of in a black box regards to what triggers good risk or bad risk. But yes, as it grows and grows, we have to look at more and more mechanisms. But one of the other things will be more and more data sources. One of the things that I don't know if people know, but Tesco's use your club card behavior to actually give them a bit more, what's the word, I suppose, increase their risk appetite based on so if you're a regular, you shop a particular way with your club card, they'll actually increase. If you fail on the Experian credit risk sort of way of doing it, they'll actually give you a bit more leeway as a customer because they've been looking at your behaviours. So there's lots of actually data sources that we can use. I think the important bit is it's not just about the fact that you have to have had an Experian, you have to have had a house, a mortgage, all of these kinds of things before you get access to credit in the future. But yeah, it's something that we have to be aware of, but there's a number of mechanisms that the guys build in to make sure that doesn't happen. To your second point, and that's part of, I didn't really talk about it much today, but part of our consumer proposition is actually empowering consumers to own and control their data. So the ability for them actually to say, okay, this is me, and they use that to understand themselves better, but they can also then, as they arrive with a brand, decide what they do and don't share. So if they trust a brand, it'll be up to them to actually share the information rather than at the moment, with a lot of things on the cookies or the way that Google operate, it's a completely different way of looking at that.
Hi, I guess I'll start with that and say I'm Ian and I'm a blogger in this domain. And I have also two questions. First, I'm just curious what other personality tests, what other psychographic assessments tools you use? You mentioned the big five, and there's certainly a lot out there, and I'd just be curious to see what else you're working with. And two, how do you address stability concerns? There's a lot of evidence shows where the big five is stable and where the big five isn't stable. So there's almost a meta concern of where can you trust the results and how often do you update them? So I'm just wondering how you address that as far as updating your customers' data.
So to go really deep into that, you can talk to one of my colleagues in one of the breaks for the big psychology. But the whole point about it is, yes, so things like context, and that's where when I was showing more about where we're going with the consumer piece, so being able to track people, continue about how you're feeling, actually looking at not asking a quiz in one go, which we do a lot of the time at the moment, being able to build on that. And when people do something that surprises us, we can ask those questions again. I think to your point, though, and I think that, when people talk about stability and pieces like that, the opportunity is that we can test that on a bigger scale than anyone else can at the moment. So a lot of the times when people are sort of talking about what works and doesn't work, we found at the moment, we've used Myers-Briggs, a number of other things as well, this is the best way to differentiate between audiences at the scale that we're working right now. But that doesn't mean that it'll stay that way. But if you want to come and find us at the break, I've brought someone who's much more deeper into this domain that can help on that.
Cool, thanks.
So.
Hello, an incredibly basic question. Somebody visits our site How can we know what their personality type is?
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. So there's the fact that we have our own community. So as people we know visit your site, we already know their personality, and that's what then starts profiling your audience. You then get to start seeing this type of person is visiting my site. So we have those 300 million profiles, those persons that we own, so they're our audience, and as they visit your site, we can start telling you the type of person that's coming to your site. But then over time, also those behaviors, so as you start seeing a particular person on your site behaves this way, as other people behave that way, you can then infer that they have the same personality type. So it's sort of, on a simple way, it's birds of a feather flock together.
Thank you. I'm sorry to make Sam run so much. My name's Roger Massey. I work for Midex Community Interest Company. We're talking with Housing Association and the local authority in East Manchester about providing credit histories for credit unions based on people who can't get an Experian report or have got CCJs and so on, based on their transactional history with local authorities, with housing associations. Would you take those kind of things into account in addition to psychometric testing?
Yeah, so the whole point with this, it comes down to the amount of data available. So the fact that emerging markets obviously is huge and very fast growth for us because there's a huge need. But there's still actually growth for our business here in the UK as well, where you've got lots of mature data sources because actually they're becoming too restrictive, those data sources. So it comes down to, in finance they use something called a Gini score. So if it's 100%, it means that you know 100% whether someone will default, yes or no. Most companies operate at Gini of between 40 and 60%, depending on their risk appetite. The lower down they go is based on, if you think about things like the Wonga, where they'll say, okay, well, at random, I'm willing to lose 50% can default because the 50% that repay are going to pay me enough money on my loan to cover the losses. And that's the scale that people work on. We can achieve just through psychographics on its own a 50%, so bang in the middle of where even companies in this country work on using things like Experian data. You add our data with something like Experian data, obviously you're pushing up your confidence level even higher on what that prediction is. So certainly any data sources that can help predict are always going to be useful and helpful.
Cool. Ed, thank you very much for that.
Cool.
That was really interesting.
Cool.
And
Thank you very much. Exit, stay left, okay.